everyone. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Marley Long, and I'll go ahead and kick things off. Today's webinar is going to focus around the 10 ways to improve adoption in Office 365, as well as how you can leverage analytics to improve adoption. A bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. If you want to share this with a colleague in the next few days, we'll go ahead and send an email to everyone who signed up with the recording as well. Feel free to connect with us on Twitter. You can tweet us at Cardiolog as well as at @Harbridge, and we'll be here to answer any questions you may have on Twitter. And of course, if you have any questions, we'll leave around 10 minutes towards the end of the webinar for questions. And you can send these questions through the GoToWebinar questions box within the panel. In regards to the agenda for today's webinar, we'll start out with a very short introduction. We'll talk a little bit about Intlock and who we are, and we'll introduce our guest speaker today. And then we'll conclude to talk about how we can leverage analytics to solve challenges in Office 365. And as I mentioned, we'll have some time towards the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can send them through the GoToWebinar panel, and we'll get to these at the end of our session today. Brief introduction. Intlock has been around for about 10 years now, since 2005. We're based out of Boston. Over the past 10 years, we've been focused on web analytics designed for SharePoint. Our flagship solution is Cardiolog Analytics, and it's built specifically for internal platforms, including all versions of SharePoint from 03 to 2013, as well as SharePoint Online and Office 365. And we can also track third-party tools like Yammer, Citrion, CRM tools, and the like. Our goal is to help our customers constantly improve SharePoint based on how it's being used. So there are three main pillars that we talk to our customers about. And the first is Monitor, which is tracking the usage within SharePoint. The second is engaging users, asking them what their needs are, what their pain points are, and what's not working for them. And then finally, the most important pillar is Enhance. And we want to make sure we're constantly improving SharePoint based on these three pillars. So the idea is to have actionable metrics, which will allow us to constantly make SharePoint better for our users. With that, I guess we'll just jump right on in. I want to introduce you to our guest speaker, Richard Harbridge. Richard, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Let me go ahead and make you presenter. All right, take it away.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. We're here to talk about a lot of different adoption methods. I'm really excited to hear about the different ways that Intlock and the Cardiolog team deals with measurement and metrics within Office 365 and SharePoint. What we're going to do is we're going to start with talking about why this is such an important topic. So I hope you guys all agree and that you're here because adoption is really important. At the end of the day, remember a couple things. One, adoption is not the end goal, right? So adoption is a means to the end goal, which is driving more business value and driving more impact on key business objectives and priorities. So if we're not delivering business value through increased adoption, then the act of increasing adoption is not going to do a lot for us. That being said, we have a long way to go. So this is a pretty good representation still today. This is from a specific customer that we worked with, where most customers, when they start to use Office 365, there's certain workloads that get heavily adopted, like Outlook and Exchange, and we see that actively used on a regular basis. But other workloads might struggle to get higher levels of adoption, and there's lots of reasons for this. What we want to do today is we want to talk about how can you improve adoption for many of these different workloads. So even if you're not using Office 365 today, let's say you're using SharePoint on-prem or you're using Yammer or using a subset of Office 365, it's still very relevant to you because what we're going to be talking about are different ways to improve adoption across the entire platform and from a suite perspective. it's also really important because as people adopt the platform, as usage increases, the platform delivers more value. This is really obvious in things like Delve, where based on usage, we actually can see more information, the search patterns are more relevant to us, but it's also really relevant for things like Yammer, right? A social network is only as powerful and capable as the number of people that are actively committed to it and using it. And another way of looking at this too is if I look at Skype for Business or an IM tool, without people using Presence and being on it on a regular basis, again, it's weakened in terms of its potential impact. So what we really want to do is we want to look at things holistically and say if we can improve adoption on many of these systems, not only will it help with hopefully realizing more value, productivity gains, being more competitive in the industry, but it will also lead to the tools themselves, in this case Office 365, being more valuable to employees that have made the commitment and are actively using it. With that, my name is Richard Harbridge. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I'm really, really friendly, so if you have questions throughout this or afterwards, please feel free to throw them out inside of this webinar, or you can put them on Twitter, or you can even follow up with me afterwards. I'm really, really friendly from a LinkedIn perspective, so you can always reach out to me, and I'd be happy to take your questions, because of course, in about I'm going to try and make this about 30 minutes. It's going to be hard to cover all the different ways people are improving adoption, but these are 10 ways based on research and work with customers that are the most popular ways that people are using to increase adoption today. So here's the cheat sheet. This is the 10 ways to improve adoption. I'm going to talk about each one, and as we talk about each of these ways to improve adoption, I'm going to highlight why it's relevant and maybe sort of the Richard perspective on it. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into some of these, and some we're going to have to do a little bit quicker in just a cursory understanding. But these are all really important parts of driving adoption and improving adoption with Office 365. Let's start with the first one, which is impacting business objectives. So the biggest thing that we run into when we work with different customers and when we ask customers, is Office 365 being well adopted? Is it, is there ways that you could improve adoption? The first thing that kind of sits underneath it all is that many organizations have not created clear objectives or reasons for why they've implemented Office 365. This has been around for a long time, right? So many organizations struggle with SharePoint or even some messaging components because there's an element of it which is we need to have it because it's infrastructure, right? It's sort of a requirement to do business, and it's an expectation that users have that we have some of these technologies like mail and social networks and things like that. But at the same time, it's also really critical to understand, well, if we're using these technologies beyond the basics, right? If we're really starting to leverage them effectively, what is that doing in terms of business impact, and how is that delivering more business impact? And so when we talk about the dreaded G word, governance, with a lot of organizations, this is really just showing that some organizations don't have sort of the basics of governance in that they understand why they implemented the technology, what needs the technology is meant to solve, or objectives that they're trying to achieve in the next few years with that technology. So let's dig into this. I'm going to try and give you an example of how you might be able to take objectives like these ones and break them down a little bit more. Because the number one thing that we find that's really slowing people down from an adoption perspective is that they don't have clear objectives and they don't have a clear value proposition for why Office 365 is going to make a difference. In other words, a lot of organizations have these platitudes, these organizational objectives for Office 365, like we're going to enhance collaboration, we're going to increase productivity. And while these sound really good, the reality is they're very difficult to argue, and it's very difficult to map solutions or break down ways of measuring whether or not you've been successful. How do you really measure whether or not you've enhanced collaboration? How do you measure whether or not you've automated and improved business processes? What we need to do is get more specific. So this has been around for a long time, this idea of a SMART objective, so specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. What we want to do is we want to take objectives like the ones we mentioned earlier, break them down till we get to a SMART level, right? So we get to a level where it's measurable, so we get to a level that's attainable based on solutions and things that we can define a little bit clearer. So let's take one of these. I've chosen automating and improving business processes as the one we're going to dig into today. If we want to automate and improve business processes, we have to understand what kind of processes we're talking about. Are they paper-based? Are they legacy system processes? Are they something else entirely? And then once we understand those, we need to figure out, well, who has an understanding of these processes? Who's sort of the main group that's managing them. And so if we get into legal processes and contract management processes, we can see that we can get pretty deep quite quickly. So we start with, yes, we have an overall goal with Office 365 to automate or improve business processes. And what we find is within legal, there's a contract management process within the company. And so what basically happens is contracts are reviewed, so people submit contracts to be reviewed, and there's a challenge where people don't know what status the contract review process is. If someone takes a look at it, how much longer will it be, those types of things. So this is an obvious solution that SharePoint workflows or other aspects, even just having this process done where there's a little bit more visibility by putting the data, the contracts themselves, inside of a document library would give you some things like modified and perhaps basic approvals. So there's definitely solutions that are really obvious when we start to break objectives down like this, and that's important because it enables not just SharePoint or Office 365 experts to determine those solutions, but it's actually obvious to many users, especially ones that have a little bit of understanding of Office 365, how they might be able to solve their problems. So what I'm getting at here is we need to break objectives down. Instead of saying we want to automate and improve business processes or we want to enhance collaboration, what we should be doing is saying things like, we would like to automate and improve our paper-based legal contract management contract review processes. Specifically, we'd like to improve response request times for contract review by XYZ, X hours, by whatever it is, right? And so that's the type of objectives we need to define, and we need to constantly be doing this. This is a continual exercise within the business. So there is a difference. Some organizations do this, and the organizations that do this see significant adoption gains because there's strategic authority, budget, and focus from the business to drive adoption. So hopefully that makes sense. What I'm going to reframe impacting business objectives as for you guys, just as a takeaway, is you want to have SMART objectives. And I don't have time to go through all the exercises to define objectives, but hopefully that really quick breakdown gives you an idea of how you might be able to use mind mapping or facilitation techniques with stakeholders to break down their objectives to the point where you can start to use SMART objectives. The next thing, and this is a big one, is completing the transition. So this is a tricky one to talk about, but let me highlight it in the only way I know how, which is with a couple quick visuals. So when you complete the transition for Office 365, what that means is it's a suite that you're buying into, right? So when you move to Office 365 or when you set up hybrid and you start to leverage and power experiences by Office 365, you need to understand that the more you invest, the more usage and the more from a broad perspective, you've transitioned different environments and different technologies on-prem into these cloud ones, the better the experience is going to be. So in other words, when you look at the app launcher, if the reality is we've only moved Exchange to the cloud and everything else has, a time delay of 6 months, a year, 2 years, etc., the reality is it's going to be really hard to drive adoption because it's much easier to drive adoption when we're on modern technology. This is a big challenge for a lot of organizations, let's say, that haven't moved SharePoint over or have specific workloads in SharePoint that they haven't moved over to Office 365. So an example of this might be your intranet, where your intranet hasn't moved over to Office 365, but you are using it for, say, OneDrive for Business. While that's great, it's going to be harder to encourage people to adopt and utilize a platform if it's less modern, right? And this makes sense, right? I don't want to spend my time and energy learning an old technology from a skill set on my resume perspective. And conversely, if I'm an employee in an organization, I'm more likely to spend time and energy on a technology that I think has broad appeal, that's more modern, et cetera. And then if we think of also some of the challenges, if we have long transitional hybrid states, especially on legacy technology where we're trying to do a sort of workaround method of hybrid versus getting onto SharePoint 2016 or at least 2013 with the new connectors, it's going to be more challenging to have that fluid and nice experience. It's going to make it easier for users to transition and adopt Office 365 capabilities. So really what I'm saying here is a couple things, right? One, getting off that legacy technology and trying to accelerate that migration process if you can, or that transition process. Some organizations have been very successful in this. Some have struggled because they don't take it the right way. So take a look at the way you're moving to Office 365 and see if there's a way to either accelerate or to ensure that your hybrid experience is quite positive. Another thing here is removing alternatives. So some organizations still have file shares or other alternatives that really don't have a place in the modern enterprise experience today. And so it's important sometimes to really cut those off and say, look, this is the way we do things, and let's be really clear this is how we do it. Sometimes even a manager or an executive within a department or a group can do this on their own. They don't necessarily need the entire organization. So keep in mind that there's many levels to when I say removing alternatives and making it more mandatory or at least enforcing it. And I think this is also a way that many organizations have found to help speed up that transition, perhaps not to just Office 365, but to specific workloads in Office 365. So when I say completing the transition, another way of rethinking this is that I'm really saying embrace the Office 365 suite. And right now, the Office 365 suite is, pretty easy to understand. It's Exchange, it's Skype for Business, it's SharePoint, it's these Office experiences. But over time, we're seeing Delve, we're seeing groups, we're seeing some of the new BI capabilities that are coming into the Office 365 suite, especially when we look at E5, which was just recently announced, which is a new suite SKU for Office 365. So again, understand when I say embrace the Office 365 suite, I mean that in the fullest sense of the word, right? So really try and do that, and you'll find that that will actually help improve adoption. Now another one is support. Now we could spend an entire 30 minutes easily, we could spend hours actually talking about support. So I'm going to just try and hit some key points on support. One of the big ones is that a lot of organizations have not thought through what kind of policies, guidance, or plans should we have in place to ensure that Office 365 support is done effectively. And so I have some examples in here. Don't worry, the slide deck is available online, and it will be available afterwards from the webinar. In addition to that, I think the webinar is being recorded, and so you should be able to watch it afterwards. You can always reach out to me if you have further questions on this. For now, I'm going to move on from the slide, so if you've been hastily taking notes, I apologize. But there's a lot of policies and guidance and plans that are sort of missing from organizations. And that can be from everything from the transitional efforts, right, content migration processes and questionnaires, to maintenance and management of things like having site and group review checklists where you review groups and sites and make sure that, say, content that shouldn't be in those environments is not in those environments, especially when we talk about confidentiality levels or things like that. Another one here is you have to have multiple tiers for escalation. So obviously, Office 365 is a big suite. There's a lot of capabilities there, and it would be really hard to manage that with just a tactical team of experts within your organization. You have to scale, and you need to work with your help desk. If you're a larger organization and you have a dedicated help desk, if you have a third party like Tutor or like other companies that you work with for managed services, you need to have them make sure that they're aware of your Office 365 and what your support arrangements are. You need to have site administrators. If you don't think of SharePoint site administrators, think of groups. So group administrators, whether it's in Yammer or whether that's in Office 365 groups. End users obviously need to be supported. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but it's really important to have just multiple tiers and to have mapped out your escalation paths, because scaling support, especially with Office 365 when there's so many different types of requests, can be quite challenging. And that brings me to my next point, which is a lot of organizations, I'm finding when I inspect the way that they measure support, they're looking at their support requests and they're cataloging them as Office 365 support request or support ticket. They're cataloging it as Outlook support ticket or Exchange support ticket. And while that's great, it's really important to add additional details, because that enables us to improve and reduce the amount of support requests we have for specific workloads. So an example, when you put in a SharePoint support ticket, don't just classify it as SharePoint, but classify it as SharePoint permissions related or SharePoint document management related or whatever it is, SharePoint workflow related. And if you do that, over time you can start to get a much better feeling for how you're supporting the organization and what kind of needs the organization might have in terms of additional training, awareness, guidance, and things like that. And so this can help infer a lot of the stuff we talked about earlier, like the policies and guidance you might provide. And of course, when we do provide guidance and policies, we need to make sure we diversify it. We provide it in different ways, and we need to. One of the ones that's unfortunately missed a lot is just one-on-one training and coaching. I'll come back to that, but I've been amazed at how many organizations aren't leveraging that, especially for key champions or influencers, and there is no better method, right? If you have a little bit of time and energy and you can scale this the right way, you can really have a lot of impact beyond just the other self-management and support methods. Doing a bit of one-to-one coaching or even classroom training can have a big impact, especially when it's tailored to the audience. So that was the really quick explanation for providing effective support, which is really create some policies, give lots and lots of guidance, and scale, scale, scale by not doing it yourself. And that requires planning. And of course, adoption itself, a lot of organizations don't have what we call an adoption plan. So they say, hey, we want to roll out Office 365. They roll out Office 365, and then there's an expectation that people will just start to leverage it or it'll be adopted on its own. We know that that's not true for a lot of reasons, and so it's really critical to think through adoption and be mindful with it and have a plan for adoption. Now the good news is you don't have to do this on your own. You can go to success.office.com. They actually have an adoption plan template and method that you can use. They have scenarios. They actually have a whole lot of resources there. Really, really an amazing site. If you've been lately, go again because they update it fairly regularly. When we work with this team, the internal Microsoft team that's doing this, it's amazing how hard they're working to try and take all the guidance that organizations are providing and put that into a format and a way that's consumable for other people. So take a look at success.office.com, specifically the adoption resources, and build an adoption plan. And of course, in that exercise of success.office.com, you'll find that you need to plan activities to drive adoption. So if you're looking for activities beyond what they have listed, I have about 50 plus activities listed in a number of places through previous presentations, at the recent book that we published, and a number of other things. So again, even if you want ideas of activities, there's a lot more obviously that are in some of those pieces of writing because we're always finding new ones as we work with different organizations. So you can always just reach out to me too, and I can send you a big list of all the activities that we've seen work well recently. Another one beyond planning adoption is that it's important to invest in adoption. So planning adoption basically is saying, look, if we're going to create an adoption plan, that means we're being mindful, we're thinking about it, and we're investing some energy earlier, hopefully, before the rollout, or after the rollout's done, that we recognize that adoption is important, and so we need to invest in it. And so that's really what I'm hoping that people will do, and that's a great way to improve adoption. Now, of course, measuring adoption is an obvious way to improve adoption because without measurement, it's hard for us to tell from a baseline perspective how much improvement we've seen. But let's talk a little bit about measurements. And there's a whole section after this presentation on that, so I won't go too deep into this. Just recognize that if we can't see increased usage and increased adoption, then that means we're not recognizing the value of the investment of just the licensing investment that you pay into Office 365, not to mention all the other effort in getting people into Office 365. So it's really important that we should track usage and adoption, and we should make sure that we're figuring it out not just by organizational analytics, but by groups and departments and by individuals even, that we really want to make sure are maximizing their usage and maximizing the value realization from Office 365. And this historically has been less of a challenge for IT because we would deploy the promise of value, right? So we would purchase something like SharePoint Server, we'd implement it with a new intranet or something, and that's really the promise of value, and value doesn't get realized until the future when people start to consume that and leverage it in new ways. When we pay for subscription licensing per user, we're really talking about value realization as people use it. Another one here is taking things like searches and providing that, not just looking at the data and reporting on it, but making sure that you're sharing that with the broader organization or key groups and individuals. So make sure you're sharing things like top usage reports and patterns as well as search logs. And again, we'll see more of this later. And lastly, you'll see a lot of new updates from Microsoft because adoption is so important, where they're improving things like creating a Delve organization view that enables people to see as an individual, how might I be able to work more efficiently? How might I be able to work better? How am I working, right? Just giving people an understanding of their base so that they can make changes. One of the things we've done recently with Office Graph is we've built some series of components that actually help with making that transition. So if you think of a simple component, you might say something like, you have contributed, which is created or modified X documents in the last week. Your peers, or the average employee, isn't contributing X more than you, and so it's with a nice little visual, and so indicating, hey, maybe you could do a little bit more, interested in knowing how to contribute, here's a link, et cetera, et cetera. But that data being driven off of Office Graph means that we can actually personalize it so that that data is based on the user context, and it's saying, this is how you work, and this might be how you could improve your working experience. And so what I'm really saying when I say measure adoption and measure information is that we want to share it. Too many times I see people doing a great job of measuring, but they don't do a great job of taking action on that information or figuring out a way to share it more broadly so that others can take action. Another note here is driving awareness and interest. So part of the adoption plan process I mentioned was creating a lot of activities, taking action. So one of the big collections of activities that you need to do is driving interest and awareness. You need to help people understand what Office 365 is, how it might be able to be leveraged, and there's a lot of ways to do this, right? You could do internal advertisement, you can do this before launch, after launch, you can do scavenger hunts, trivia contests, competitions, a lot of these types of things. There's a lot of really interesting stories I could tell if I had more time around how organizations are actually tackling competitions. And so one of the big ones we see frequently is time boxing it. So you do something like a 31 days of Office 365, just like you could do 31 days of Yammer, and then you break down a number of activities and contests and challenges per week with different prizes. And then you do that over a course of a month, and you look at the impact that you've had. Specifically, if you create competitions that relate to workloads or specific things that you're trying to drive usage of, you can actually measure really well the impact that you've had and how long that sustains before perhaps you need to do another 31 days of Office 365 or some other campaign. And of course, Microsoft is releasing new capabilities all the time in Office 365, so let's use that as an opportunity to engage users and help them understand that there's new ways to work. So one of the basic ones we've seen is when you take an app experience that's been released, like the new Delve app experience, and you really message to your users, hey, have you tried out Delve? And we know that many users haven't tried out Delve. So saying to them, have you tried this new app experience? It works great within our Office 365 instance, blah, blah, blah. Here's like some messaging internally. They go download the app, and then you can see how many people are using the app, and you can actually see how much impact you're driving in terms of awareness around, say, an Office Delve experience through the app, etc. So it's really important to note if there's new capabilities that are coming out, we want to echo the messaging that, say, Microsoft provides and make sure that that's tailored for our organizations and take responsibility for the fact that it's our job collectively to drive awareness for some of these new experiences and capabilities. And it's also important because obviously we want to make sure we have governance and other things in place, and the best way to do that is to understand those experiences. So what we're really saying with driving awareness and interest is I've seen too many patterns where organizations are not doing enough to drive awareness. And when we, as a team at To The Lead, have done a lot of research on this, we found that the biggest gap a lot of times for organizations is that they don't do enough awareness-based activities. These aren't hard to do. There's lots and lots of examples of how to do them. So you should try and pick a couple and just do those over the next little while to see what kind of impact you can have. Now, of course, guiding understanding is probably the hardest thing to highlight here, but it is a great way to improve adoption. Remember that the end goal of adoption wasn't just increasing usage, it was actually having a greater impact on business objectives. So what we're really saying here is if you want to guide understanding, it's really important to recognize that we want to guide adoption, right? We want to make sure that people are using things in better ways, right? So a lot of users might use Outlook to share documents, but we know that it's much more effective to use, say, OneDrive for Business or SharePoint or groups to do that because then more people can take part and there's a lot more capabilities that come with that. Plus we have, a lot of less challenges around collating results and things like that. So we know that there's lots of ways people can use Office 365. What's important is that we provide guidance on what people can do in Office 365. So as a baseline, and this could be an awareness activity, but I think it's a little bit more guidance related because what you're really trying to do is say, here's different things you can do. Did you know you could do this? Have you tried doing this, right? And so you can combine this with campaigns to really drive people, to challenge them, to reward them for doing some of the different things that they can do in Office 365. So that's one core element of providing guidance. The other big one is helping them understand when they should use something versus when they should use something else. So Office 365 sometimes has multiple ways of accomplishing something because users can come from different directions. They might really love Outlook, and so they're like, how do I do this in an Outlook experience? And there are ways to do that. So what's important here is when we look at Office 365, there are times when a user might say, well, do I communicate this thing in an email, in an Office 365 group, in a Yammer group, should I communicate it through IM? Should I communicate it in a different way, right? Through a document collection or something like that, or in a discussion board in SharePoint, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of times that users have to make decisions on when to use what, and what we need to do as organizations is provide high-level organizational guidance, group guidance, or champion-level guidance, and then finally end-user guidance. So my escape here is that you can actually go download this white paper. It's about 60 plus pages, and it goes through all this in depth. So here's a quick preview. I won't have time to go through all this. It talks about the importance of providing guidance at those multiple levels, individual, group, and organizational. So this is also in the white paper. It talks about the importance of making your way to a more optimized organization view, right? So where we use more of the technology. So we maybe go from using Outlook, SharePoint, and Skype for Business to using Yammer as well, to potentially introducing something like OneDrive for Business. And then over time, as we introduce more and more capabilities, we can see a transition in terms of how people use things, you know, in terms of immediacy and urgency, and which audiences are using it and how are they using it. So we want to track all that. And of course, there's scenario guidance. So when you provide guidance on when to use what, you need to do it in context. So you need to do it in context of a scenario. You have to explain, here's a scenario, common one you probably run into. Here's why it might make more sense to use groups or SharePoint or Yammer instead of Outlook, right, which is probably the de facto for most users. And so again, all that's in this white paper. Sorry I don't have more time to cover it. If you're more interested in this, there's also an Ignite talk where this is discussed for about an hour and 15 minutes. So that's guiding understanding, and what I'm really talking about with guiding understanding is guiding better usage. So that's what we're trying to do, and that'll improve adoption. We also want to coach and find champions. So if we want to coach and find champions, this is probably the #1 way in which people learn, and most research supports this. So when we think of champions, it's really important to recognize from a learning perspective that this is the most helpful and it's the most used method people use to learn. So there are other methods, right? We have formal training, classroom training, we have online forums, manuals, things like that that people can go. We have a lot of people use Office Video, and they create really great interactive training sessions that are more targeted or tailored versus using the stuff that's online that's available to everyone. So there's lots of approaches here, but the #1 way people learn and find useful is with coworkers. And so what's important is to find those champions. These are non-managers often. And they're not in IT. So we go find these champions, we go find these influencers, we coach them, we help them. A lot of organizations might struggle to find them. There's lots of methods to find these champions. One example an organization used was they looked for those who had installed Firefox or Chrome, because that was them trying to be more productive and not use the out-of-the-box experience. I'm not knocking Internet Explorer, by the way. I'm just saying this was a method that they used to help figure out which users might be potential users that have an interest in learning more about technology, and that might be better opportunities for becoming coaches and coworkers that are maximizing learning in the organization. Another one method that I've seen that's worked really well here is to take best-in-class showcases. So you take users, typically non-managers and other people in the organization that have done a great job creating, say, an Office 365 group, or they've done a great job creating a Yammer group and managing that group, or they've done a great job creating a SharePoint site. And so we take those, we do a quick little write-up about it, grab some screenshots, and put it into a nice showcase so that not only can we show off that user and make them feel more validated and valued within the organization, but we can also connect them to other people that are looking to do the same thing. And this helps reduce impact on support because it means users are helping users. And of course, we just talked about the importance of having that from a champion and from a learning perspective. So coaching and finding champions is a huge way to improve adoption. And what I'm really saying here is you need to continue engaging champions. So I've seen a lot of organizations recognize this. They identify champions, and then they do a whole lot of exercises in launch or just after launch for a short period of time, and then they forget about champions. And I mean that in a literal sense, that it's like unless the champions are asking for things, they kind of don't engage them. They don't have budget. They don't have a plan for constantly engaging these champions or influencers, or finding new ones, which is also just as important. And so again, it's really important to think of this as an ongoing activity. And so when you do your adoption planning and other exercises, you need to constantly be thinking, how do we find and discover more champions, and how do we continue to engage these champions? For feedback, feedback's a huge means for improving adoption. And normally when we talk about feedback, a lot of people think of surveys and sort of one-way things where you push and you say, here's a whole lot of stuff, can you give me a response? And you try and pull after you push the messaging. And what we found is, and this picture is showing an example of it, it's sometimes much better to engage for feedback. So engaging users for feedback versus just eliciting and trying to capture it. So surveys, polls, and feedback are still a good method, let me be really clear, and there's really great ways of doing this. I'm sure Inlock will talk about their methods as well, but the way you want to go about doing this is not a generic survey, it's not a generic poll, it's targeted. So the more targeted you can be, the more effective your feedback is going to be. And then of course, exercises like usability testing, diary studies, card sorting, games that you do with users can really help you maximize your understanding of how they do things today, how they might be able to improve your different structures in Office 365, like your taxonomy, your intranet layout, things like that. And so it's really important to really engage users, which means that these are more collaborative activities versus just saying, here's a survey, can you fill this out? And what you'll find is if you're engaging employees, you'll be interviewing them, you'll be discussing things with them, and you'll get more valuable success stories. You'll get contextual stories that give you all the understanding of where the user was, what they went through, why they did certain things, and this can be really, really valuable. Now you can still use things like capture stories on Office 365 and then follow up with users and do interviews, but it's really important to make sure that you get full context for these and that you really engage with the users that have done this. And of course, the last one, so engaging users for feedback is what we're saying instead of eliciting and capturing feedback. And the last one is integrating and building solutions. This one should be obvious. If we use Office 365 to solve business problems, we're going to get increased adoption. If there's processes that are built into Office 365, if there's scenarios in which we use Office 365 to solve those business problems. So the big gap that I see here in the industry is a lot of organizations don't do an effective job of actually capturing which solutions have been built and showcasing those. So think about it in your organization today. I am sure there are people that have built wonderful little solutions, and that could be just a custom list or two inside of SharePoint. That could be a beautiful Excel document. That could be just using Outlook rules in a unique way, right? Or using a shared calendar in a special way. So there's lots of people in your organization that, to them, they've built a solution. What you want to do is find these, discover these. There's lots of ways to capture them. There's lots of ways to discover them, and then document them. Take some pictures, validate it, showcase them, talk about how great the user is who helped build this, if it's a business one. Or if it's an IT solution that you've built, talk about that. And create a marketplace almost internally where other people can see what kind of solutions they could take advantage of or things that they could do inside of Office 365. And of course, you'll see that drive adoption as well. So integrating and building solutions, in my mind, is really just thinking about Office 365 as a platform and thinking of it as, hey, we're building things on Office 365, or we're using Office 365 to solve business needs. And that's sometimes a little bit more than what's out of the box. And I think that's a huge opportunity for a lot of organizations. Think of Office app add-ins and things like that. So there's some resources in here. Again, I grabbed the deck that's online or the follow-up webinar material recording, et cetera, to grab all these. So there's lots and lots of resources that I've wanted to map out with you guys and share. And then, of course, thank you for this part of the section, which is really about the 10 ways to improve adoption. I'm going to pass it back over to my colleagues at Inlock, and they're going to explain how they tackle some measurement and why measurement and metrics is so important.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard. That was really incredibly helpful, and I think a lot of organizations can take some good insights from your presentation. Okay. And I'm just going to take control now.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and go over the last topic for this morning, and we'll talk about how several of the items that Richard was discussing can be tied into analytics and how analytics can really help out when you're trying to do things like measuring adoption. Of course, I see there are a few questions so far, but if there are any more, feel free to send them over in the GoToWebinar panel, and we'll bring Richard back in a few moments to go over those questions at the end. So first of all, why do we need analytics when talking about SharePoint or Office 365? So the key here is that you can only manage what you measure. So only can we know what's going on in SharePoint or in Office 365 if we define if our launch was successful at all, measuring if people are using it, if adoption is increasing, is by being able to measure what's going on, and that's really the end goal, and that's what we help our customers with. How can we measure deployment and analyze it and then help customers improve their environments based on what's actually going on? So if we break this down a little bit more into some subcategories, we're going to talk about specifically about tracking adoption with analytics. So over the course of different weeks and months, if people are using SharePoint more, different departments, etc., we can actually show management that adoption is actually increasing, and the training we're providing them is beneficial in helping our users leverage SharePoint. Through analytics, we can also measure improved productivity. So a great example of this is through search. If we find out that everyone is searching for the same content, then let's put a link on the home page, save everyone those 30 seconds each day that they're searching for that same popular content. Collaboration. This is a huge goal for helping SharePoint Office 365, helping different teams and employees collaborate. Of course, offices can span across various states, countries, and time zones, so analytics help to show that there is collaboration and that people are really leveraging the tool for collaboration. And finally, engagement. So there's a lot of new social features within SharePoint, anything from communities beyond just viewing content, liking content, sharing content, writing content, and more. So we want to make sure that people are leveraging the ability to use these communities. If there are communities with lower engagement levels, we can pinpoint them with analytics and then offer them very targeted training because we know that these communities aren't leveraging SharePoint or Office 365 as often. And that's why we need analytics when talking about SharePoint. So I want to break this down quickly into 3 different areas. And the first is content analytics. So there's been a big shift here when talking about adoption from just page views to more kind of social metrics. So besides what's being viewed very often, we're going to see what content is most influential and then make that content easier for users to find. And this can be done, like I said, through links on the homepage. And we define influential content by things such as comments, most likes, highest ratings, followers, etc. Next, we'll jump into users. And of course, a key in adoption, as opposed to seeing what users are viewing today and how many users are viewing content, we're going to focus our analytics around how users are interacting with each other. So as opposed to just seeing how many unique users there are, we're going to try and analyze who are the most influential users within our organization and see if we can push more people to become influenced. And once we know who are the top influencers or evangelists, we can hand them over more power, like bringing them to do talks during lunches. But first, we have to know who they are before we can even begin empowering them. So analytics is what helps us find out who these SharePoint evangelists are. And we find that out by seeing how many followers specific individuals have, how much they're contributing through posts, comments, and running reports for things like that. The third main area when talking about adoption is going to be around community analytics. So again, a shift from the basic usage that was popular a few years ago, which is just page views, to actual engagement within those communities. Here we talk about things like active discussions, are their questions being answered or unanswered for weeks, and then we can see which communities are less active, and we can pinpoint with more support and more training to try and improve those communities' adoption rates and overall SharePoint experience. So now I'll quickly show a brief example of some of these metrics that you can find in our product, Cardiolog Analytics, and then afterwards we'll conclude with just a brief Q&A. So this is an example of an analytics dashboard On the left-hand side, you can see the entire hierarchy within SharePoint. So here we're tracking a 2010 farm, a 2013 farm, also SharePoint Online tenant. And we can also see any object here, an entire farm, a site, a page, and so forth, to get these instant dashboards showing us data that we just talked about. So things like popular content or top search phrases, like things that people can't find, for example. And from here, we can also integrate, Cardiolog integrates with Microsoft's Power BI, which is a really great interface. I know Richard had some examples of metrics in his presentation as well. Those were taken from the new Power BI interface. And it's really a great way to analyze all of this data, and it makes it really easy to consume and use. So I have this dashboard here with a lot of different widgets. We've got, page views by group name and also by device, page views by month, page views by country, by browser, etc. And I wanted to show you also how Power BI has this amazing Ask a Question box, where here, instead of creating new dashboards and new reports, you can simply type in whatever you want to find out. So for example, I typed in the Ask a Question box, page views by browser, and then right away, in a very ad hoc way, we receive an instant metric showing us what browsers people are using. So for example, if your users shouldn't be using Firefox, and then we can see that that's actually the third browser right here with over 2,906 page views, and those were made using Firefox. So you can, make pushes to push the other browsers in the organization that you're trying to get users to use. So that's just a very quick example of some of the metrics that can be provided here. And so we have about 10 minutes left until the end of our time today. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of those questions. If you didn't have time to send over your questions, feel free to type those into the GoToWebinar panel now, and I'll give you guys just a few minutes if you want to submit, or a few seconds, I'm sorry, just to submit some questions, and then we'll get these answered for you guys.
So far, there's been one question on third-party dashboards. Earlier, I had the reference slide. You've heard an explanation where Intlock also has a method for doing the dashboards. I think it's important that it's connected. So I love the way that you guys are approaching this because it's integrated with Office 365 Power BI and where Microsoft is going with some of these reporting metrics. But there are definite gaps, right? There's some things that to date, Office 365 still doesn't provide effective reporting on, and so there's a lot of times where a third-party tool can add a lot of value, and that's obviously why a third-party tool might make sense for some of those metrics and measurements. Another question that I got as a direct message on Twitter, so if you're comfortable, I'll share that while we're waiting, was one of the things that an organization. So this organization basically hasn't started, and so they said, what are like a couple things that we should do before we get started? I mentioned a whole lot of ways to drive adoption, but is there like a simpler sort of checklist of things that we should do? And to that end, success.office.com does have a pretty good starting point from an adoption plan because it talks about the key things you need to do. And then, of course, you can definitely take a look at this deck and the material here as well as some other things. But another one we found is that just asking questions sometimes can go a long way. So sometimes with organizations, the gap is that no one's asked certain questions, and so by asking those questions early in the process, we can find out how ready the organization really is for adoption planning or how ready they are for ensuring that this is going to be effectively utilized and adoption will be successful. And so a couple examples of those might be, has a clear purpose been established, or does a culture of sharing and trust already exist in the organization? Another question that we've seen is, speaking of champions earlier, have they been identified? Do we know who those are? What about influencers? And another great question is, how do we deal with leadership? So does leadership know how we plan to drive adoption? Do they understand why we think adoption planning is important and why we're investing in it? Has leadership themselves embraced and adopted the technology? So there's lots of questions like this that by asking internally and then breaking down the answers, you can set yourself up a lot further for success. And certainly, it's a great way to qualify whether or not you're really prepared for what's coming with Office 365 and the adoption needs there.
Great. And actually, I just received a question for you, Richard. So you spoke about awareness-based activities in the presentation, and you said you didn't have much time to provide an example, but maybe now you could provide an example of some of these awareness-based activities that you've seen, maybe that you've seen organizations use in the past.
Yeah, I'd love to. So one of my favorite ones from an awareness perspective is it's simple, but it has a big impact. It's sending out when you send out an email, it's making sure that you sort of do an email that just has a portion of the content. So the rest of the content is either in your intranet, or it's in an Office 365 group, or it's in Yammer, etc. So people want to get like the full amount. This is a marketing technique where you're basically kind of driving people to the content by sharing an element of it, and it's better in many cases. So let me give a couple examples of how this could be used. And this is something an individual can use, that's why I like it, versus some of these other things that are harder from an organization perspective to adopt. So as an individual, what you do is, let's say you want to recognize great work that someone did on your team or in your group or in your department. So what you'll do is you'll go to Yammer, if you have Office 365 and you're deployed Yammer, and you'll praise them on Yammer, right? Or you'll go into a different place, perhaps, that you deal with praise, and do that in that whatever method that makes sense. But you have basically a place where people can comment, they can contribute, that they can share in the praise. And then what you're doing is you're referencing that when you send out an email to people saying like, hey, I just wanted to know, Susie did a great job on this, really, really appreciated it. Or perhaps you're going to post into a different tool that you use for praise internally, and you reference that, say, Yammer conversation. Or in the team meeting, right, when you're having a broad team meeting and you're on a Skype for Business meeting, you'll highlight it and then put the link in the window so that people can go and contribute to that praise. And the reason for this exercise is that people start to move towards the tools like Yammer Praise and other things where many people can take part, where it stays forever so that that user can reference it in the future, and that tends to be pretty easy for people to do. Another one is obviously sending tips and tricks emails on a regular basis. You can also schedule sort of buzz days or continual awareness campaigns. So these are days where you specifically either if you have a sort of localized offices, you can have a presence in the office, maybe some kiosks in the front or something like that that people can see and take part in. Sometimes they're not in-person events, but there's a series of webinars and training and other things that are available, and you're engaging with people to try and elicit and make sure that they come. You can do surveys and things like that to spread awareness, because in your survey itself it might indicate ways that people can improve their usage and working, and so that might drive people to it. Another big one is taking those metrics and putting them on your portal. So there's been really creative ways that organizations have done this in terms of sharing that. I talked about Office Graph, but really taking, again, those metrics and sharing them can make a big impact, because sometimes departments feel like they need to improve usage. So one organization did a charity campaign. They wanted to do is increase profile fill rates for Office 365. So you have Sharepoint profiles, or you have Office 365 profiles, I guess now under Dell. And so those profiles need to be filled out to improve, people search, to improve a lot of the experiences in SharePoint, especially if you're using some of those properties for, say, workflows. And so this organization basically did a charity campaign where they donated $1 to a charity for each user that filled out their profile within a certain window of time, and the department that did the most, that filled out the most profiles, gets to choose which charity gets it. So it doesn't need to be $1, it can be whatever amount, but creating opportunities where people feel like, I know I need to do this, but this is a reason for me to do it now, and if I don't do it now, I'm kind of not a great person, because I'm reducing the opportunity for somebody else to benefit, right, from this in a charitable way. And so there's lots of social pressures and other things that come with that situation that will help drive the outcome. So sometimes figuring out those different social angles, as well as obviously creating campaigns and activities that do it like a charity campaign, can also drive it. I've got lots more, but maybe I'll throw it back in case there's some other questions before I continue on.
Sure. So I guess just this will be our last question. So you talked about SMART objectives, and someone is asking about SMART objectives for collaboration.
Okay, that's a fun one. So a lot of times what people do is they say, I want to enhance collaboration, or you can really pick any word. And so my good friend Paul Clumsy does a really good way of representing this. So imagine you have a current state, and one, people have to understand the current state. So there's a gap there in some organizations where stakeholders or other people don't understand the current state. So let's assume we get a shared understanding of the current state. Once we have shared understanding of the current state, we need to envision the future state, right? So what's the goal? What's the ambition? So what's the organization going to be like a year from now or 2 years from now? So when you take something like enhancing collaboration, which is ambiguous, which is a platitude, what you do is you say that's kind of in the middle, and we have current state and we have future state, and that's in the middle. So what we're really asking is not, what is enhanced collaboration, but instead we're saying things like, okay, if we were to enhance collaboration, what would life be like? What would the organization be like? What activities would be different a year from now or in this future state? Like, what would be different? And so then typically you can start to get into dialogue where people can explain what's different, what they believe would be different in terms of usage, in terms of behaviors. There's lots of cultural and changes in behavior that a lot of people point out with collaboration. One of the biggest ones is that people work more openly. So a lot of organizations, and this is a little bit better than enhancing collaboration, right? So if you have an objective saying, we want to help people work more openly, we want to encourage people to work more openly, well, that means they need to understand the collective and shared benefits of working openly. We also need to understand that an optimistic work attitude is going to be much better than a pessimistic one, obviously, for working openly. There's different technologies that we would want to see leveraged to ensure openness. And so we can start to think of measurements for working openly by things like how many users that are using OneChart for Business use that shared with everyone folder. So another example for collaboration, as you start to dig into it and people talk about what work might be like in the future, when they talk about collaboration, they talk about individuals, how do I frame this, working in a way in which individuals are not just responsible, but they're creative and innovative in terms of how they work together. So one simple approach for this is kind of asking people in performance reviews, this is nothing to do with Office 365, but you're basically saying, what have you done that impacted others, and what have you done that others impacted you, right? And asking those two questions and then reframing the answers over time in ways that connect to the technology can have a really big impact. And so you start to break down the eventual goal of having people basically have more interest in a do-it-yourself approach. And when they do a do-it-yourself approach, they're trying to explore, and so maybe so let me frame, maybe the need here is you want people to feel more comfortable exploring and discovering new ways of working, right? And that will lead to more efficient workers, right? And so especially when it comes to technology and these modern approaches. And so again, if that's your objective, let's break that down into how do we define a measurable way of saying people like to discover and work in new ways, right? And then you break it down further. I don't know if that answered the question because it's a hard question to answer, but I'm hoping some of those examples and that higher level approach and methodology helps some people on the call.
Perfect. So that's all the questions that we have thus far. Again, Richard, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out today. Very powerful presentation, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Anytime. Pleasure.
Again, you can reach Richard at rharbridge.com or at rharbridge on Twitter. And you can reach us at intlock.com if you have any questions, comments, etc. And again, we'll be sending out this recording in the next couple of days. Thank you.